right. Well, hello, everybody. So today I have with me Steve Ditto. Steve is the founder of Ditto and Associates, and he is here to talk about the fiduciary demands for employers. So Steve is a senior healthcare executive. He's got over 30 years working in the space. He's had a ton of experience working with large health systems, physician groups, digital health companies, and he's also the author of the Health Plan Compliance Advantage Fiduciary Handbook and newsletter for executives, and has a ton of great resources and tools out there for executive board directors and employer health plans on fiduciary responsibilities. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Steve also, kind of became a patient years ago with an autoimmune condition. So he's kind of taken the lens from the patient perspective as well, which is really interesting. And he is really focused now on helping employers, health plan fiduciaries, and patients really take control of their healthcare costs, challenge wasteful spending, and secure better health outcomes. So great to have you today, Steve.
Yeah, Lindsay, thank you for that introduction.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, let's go ahead and get started. So one thing that we'd like to just kind of start with, like grounding the conversation on, is maybe we can talk a little bit about an employer's fiduciary responsibility in the context of healthcare benefits. So what does it actually mean? Why is it important? How does it show up in the real world? And who at the employer is really kind of ultimately responsible for this?
Yeah, all really good and topical questions today. And so, a couple of things, maybe just some quick context. Whenever you have this conversation, generally you hear the word ERISA thrown around. And ERISA acronym, Employee Retirement Income Security Act. And it's a set of laws. It's been around for a long time. It's really what regulates health plans and investment plans like 401ks. And for a bunch of historical reasons, it's primarily been focused on 401ks and pension plans, primarily because of all the money associated with it and making sure that there's better governance around those plans. But now it's really being focused on health plans, and we're starting to hear more of it in the media and unfortunately in lawsuits, and we'll talk about that in a lot more detail. So there's ERISA. What ERISA really talks about, and you mentioned, is fiduciary responsibility. And so the first question is always, what's a fiduciary? And a fiduciary, definition, is someone who has discretionary authority or control over the management of a plan or its assets. And so that's the official ERISA definition. And where some of the complexity comes in is there's a couple of different kinds of fiduciaries. One is named and the other is functional. So on the name side, when your health plan is created, maybe there's a board resolution behind it, they literally name someone to be the fiduciary. And so it's not just a role, it's a name, it's a person. But then on the functional side of all of this, it really is someone who exercises discretion over the management or the administration of the plan. So as an example, maybe they pick PBMs and manage PBMs. Or someone who exercises discretion with respect to the money, the assets in the plan. And so, as an example, fiduciary might say, we're going to put more benefits or more money into our pharmacy benefits or direct it somewhere else. And so it's both the money, the assets, as well as the vendors, if you will, that are working with the plan. So here's the important part that I would say, and one that's historically been missed, and the one that's now really being focused on, particularly in these lawsuits. Fiduciaries are legally obligated to act in the best interest of plan participants and beneficiaries. And essentially what that means is if you're an employer, an employer-sponsored health plan, it's your employees and their families or the other dependents that are covered. And really where this is different than some people have either thought or acted in the past is that doesn't mean the best interest of the plan. It doesn't mean the best interest of the company, and it definitely doesn't mean the best interest of the boss golfing buddies who might be your broker or vendor in some cases. And so that's a real takeaway. And fiduciaries and the fiduciary committee with all of them together really need to show that they are fulfilling their duties, that they are loyal to plan participants, that they are making prudent decisions, that they're using disciplined processes. And that's the bottom line of ERISA and fiduciary duties.
That's great. Thanks, Steve. So I know you mentioned lawsuits. So the J&J lawsuit has been like big news. Everybody, I think, has read about that one. Can you tell us a little bit about like why this is so important and how this will be impacting employer behavior going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. So, J&J was one of the first. Wells Fargo was right in there within a month. And then just recently, within the past month, JP Morgan was also identified as a company. They're all being, sued as part of class action suits. That all those class action suits are being brought by the same, plaintiff attorney. And they all make similar arguments. And the arguments are that all of those companies breached their fiduciary duty to their plan participants and beneficiaries, again, their employees. And specifically, what they're saying is they didn't use discipline processes and they didn't make prudent decisions. And they're specifically, in all of these cases, focused on the pharmacy benefits, on PBMs. And the one thing that makes JP Morgan maybe a little different and a bit of a bellwether is JP Morgan, as probably everybody knows, does a ton of business in healthcare. They sponsor the big healthcare investment conference. And they made some explicit decisions that they weren't going to hold their vendors like CVS feet to the fire if they were also going to maintain a business relationship with them. And JP Morgan was told explicitly, and their fiduciaries were told explicitly, if you stay with CVS, it's going to cost you and your employees $60 million in specialty drugs alone based on the deal that you have. And they made a decision to not pursue that and essentially prioritize their business interests over the interest of the plan and the participants. And consequently, they're being sued. And consequently, class action suits take a long time to, kind of work their way through the courts. But ultimately, they may make a bunch of plaintiff attorneys very rich because they decided not to pursue the sole interest of their participants.
It's so interesting. Yeah. And I mean, you'd kind of think that they would maybe be a little bit above that, to your point, with like their expertise in healthcare, but apparently not.
Yeah, well, it's not only their expertise in healthcare, but it's their wild profitability. And so JP Morgan made almost $60 billion with a B dollars last year. And so if they had taken 1/10 of 1% of that profit and said, hey, we're going to use that to, lower our premiums or somehow or another, lower the cost of these specialty drugs, they could have kept their employees whole and kept their relationship with CVS. But they didn't do that, and consequently, they're being sued.
That's scary. Well, you mentioned kind of the importance of aligning the PBM models with the fiduciary obligations as well. Would you talk a little bit about just like what are some blind spots for most employers in terms of the PBM contracts and how they're structured?
Yeah. Yeah, so blind spots is an interesting way to describe it because, PBM contracts are notoriously complex and opaque and long, like dozens of pages long. And really, what I've heard described as well lawyered, meaning you can read it and still don't know what it means, at the end. And in terms of blind spots, I've had industry experts tell me that they've identified 50 or more ways that PBMs can use those contracts to obscure their income and to, essentially make revenue in all sorts of ways that are not in the best interest of plan participants. And so there's 50 or more. I'll give you 5 big ones just to kind of start with. The one that gets a lot of interest from people, a lot of focus from people, are gag clauses. And it's an interesting term, but, essentially it means they're not going to share your data with you. And so, you can ask them and they've got 100 different reasons why they won't share, right? It's hard or it's expensive or there's HIPAA requirements, but it's in fact illegal for them to do that. And it has been for several years now. And unfortunately, even though the law on ERISA and the CAA require them to, there's not a lot of teeth in the enforcement of that. And so, people are still fighting it, but that's probably number one. Number two, I'll say is, everybody's heard about rebates. And do you get rebates? And rebates are effectively a PBM and a drug manufacturer actually paying a PBM to put their drug on the floor. And so that's called a rebate. In other industries, that would be called a kickback. But that is what
Yeah.
the current
Terminology.
it's definitely what makes the ecosystem go around. But the idea is that again this PBM is negotiating this rebate on the employer's behalf, and many employers have in their contract, and some PBMs will say we'll give you 100% of the rebates. But what they're doing behind the scenes is recharacterizing those rebates as something else, like an admin fee or a transaction fee or some other, fee, and it's not quote unquote a rebate. And so they'll keep it, and very, few of maybe, 20%, maybe no percent actually makes it back to the employers or to their participants. The other one that's a really interesting one is, and very common, probably heard, is spread pricing. And not everyone knows quite how spread pricing works, again, because the payment process is so complex. But essentially, in this whole PBM process, it's really the pharmacy, the retailer, who buys the drug at a certain price. And then the PBM is supposed to reimburse them. And so the way that it often works is, let's just pick a number. The drug, or rather the retail pharmacy, buys a drug for $1. The PBM reimburses them something. And that something might be $1.10, right? So they're just making 10 cents. It might actually be less than that. And pharmacies actually lose a lot of money occasionally just trying to stay in network and in the contract. But then the PBM turns around and charges the employer and the participants $5, and that's not unlikely, like 500% increase, and essentially for doing nothing. It's just that they're able to obscure what they're buying and what they're paying, and so again, that spread pricing probably generates, depending on the PBM, 25 to maybe 30% of their profit just comes from playing that game. The other game, and it truly is a game, is a lot of contracts are written on what's referred to as percent of AWP, the average wholesale price. And so the PBM will come in and say, because we're so large and because we have so much negotiating ability, we're going to get you pricing 80% below AWP. Well, AWP is really just a made up number. It's not realistic. And if the employer were to say something like, well, you say you're going to give me 80%, but this other one is giving me 90%. Can you match that? What they do is they go back to the drug manufacturer and they say, bump up your pricing high enough so that I can actually make that look like a 90% discount, not an 80% discount. So again, it's just fudge. And it's just not a great way to structure a contract, but it's a very prevalent way. And those two things, percent of rebate and percent of AWP, are the way that most contracts are written, when in fact what they ought to focus on is just lowest cost, right? Just give me the lowest cost, strip away all that other stuff. Last one of the top 5 I'll talk about is a formulary game. And a formulary is when the PBM says, here are all the list of drugs that you can buy. And some of these are generics and some of these are specialties, and you'll pay me something, for each of these. And so what the trend has been over the past few years is that they are classifying more and more drugs as specialty. And specialty is meant to be, it's a complex, it's a volatile drug. Maybe it needs to be refrigerated, or maybe it needs to be specially infused as opposed to just a drug that you can take as a pill. And so they've been classifying more and more things as, specialty generics. And all it is, trying to put more drugs in a bucket that they can charge more for. And it's not unusual to find generics in there that are being charged thousands of percent more than what you can buy in the market. And so anyway, those are, probably you asked for blind spots. Those are glaring blind spots that almost every contract from a big 3 PBM in particular will tend to have.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And that's like your top 5 out of 50. So, that just gives you insight into how complicated those contracts are. I think maybe because of that, we're seeing a lot of demand and kind of the rise of these alternative PBM models and transparent PBM models. Would love to kind of get your thoughts on what you think is the future of those models, and if you think there's going to be more adoption of that in the coming years.
Yeah. Well, so first off, this is a highly concentrated and vertically integrated business. And so, the 3 big PBMs, who are all owned by the 3 big insurance companies, have about 85% market share. And when you kind of go a little further, into that, the big 6 PBMs that are owned by the 6 biggest insurance companies have pretty close to 94 or 95%. So highly concentrated, highly verticalized. And so all the other PBMs out there, and there are probably 50 or more of them, are having to compete against that. And so, and compete against, all those 50 different ways that PBMs try to take your money. And so the way that most of them have landed at this point is transparency and pass-through pricing. And so the transparency part is, hey, I understand all these 50 different ways, and we're not going to do that to you. The pass-through piece is we're essentially going to give you drugs at cost, and either we're going to do a little more cost plus, and you've heard that from like Mark Cuban as an example, or we'll do something that's just a flat fee per prescription, $5, $6, $7. And so just trying to make that pricing as clear and as easy to understand, and to the degree that they can, align their pricing with the interest of the payer, and in this case, the health plan. So the differentiating part that they're all trying to bring to the table to some degree or another, but here's where there's some real differences, is one is on the clinical side. And so, making sure we've got the formulary right, making sure that members are getting the right drugs with the highest efficacy, and they're adhering to them, and they're getting better. So it's not just price, but it's, you're really getting the benefit of the benefit. The second piece is really the technology side of this. And so, coming to the table with really great analytics, understand what's going on in your population, being able to monitor that population, and then having flexibility to manage, either at an individual level or at a, subpopulation level, how the benefits are managed. And so that's the big differentiator. The last piece you touched on was adoption. And so, what it's going to take is companies that are willing to move their business from that 85 to 95% of part of the market to the 5% part of the market, and that's hard, right? So first off, the big guys, they're vertically integrated. They're some of the biggest, most profitable companies in the world, and they give more money to Congress than virtually any other industry, and they're not hesitant to lie to Congress, and they fight the FTC. And they're not going to give up those profits easily, right? So even whatever they say, whatever lawyers do, lawyers mean legislators, I don't expect them to go away anytime soon, right? So the good news is that all those lawsuits, all that media coverage is really shining a light on all of these practices. And there are people and companies who want to step away and want an alternative, want to take all these compliance risks off the table, want to get the savings, want to get the better benefits, want to get the healthier employees. And so, if you're going to be a good steward of your dollars, you're going to want to move away from one of those, conflicted incumbents to one of the 50 alternatives. And so, what do you do? And so I've been trying to help answer that question. I've been working with the Validation Institute, which is an independent organization that assesses healthcare vendors. They've now started looking at PBMs, and the assessment is how transparent really is their contract? Do they actually deliver on their savings, and do they actually deliver on the promised outcomes? And so, and they put a guarantee behind it of anywhere from $25,000 to $100,000 that, if you work with these smaller companies, they will be able to, or have shown that they're able to deliver on those benefits. And so that's what we're really trying to do, is kind of create a validated ecosystem.
That's super interesting. Yeah, I've worked with other companies and other newer spaces within the industry that have also worked with Validation Institute and done similar work. So I think that's really interesting and a really smart approach. So, I think I think when you think about this market, obviously, brokers have a ton of influence. There's other vendors as well. What would you recommend for those types of organizations that want to be a little bit more innovative and really kind of help the employer with mitigating these types of risks? Like, what would you recommend that they do to kind of support, the trend and where things are going?
A couple of themes. First off, benefit teams are super busy, right? They're not necessarily experts. It's hard for them to choose between solutions. It's always been that way. What they really need help from is unconflicted experts and people who are working for them, paid for them, aligned with their interests, and seek them out, right? And there aren't many of them, and your traditional broker is probably not one of them. Right, but find those unconflicted experts. The second piece that I would say is, there's been a trend forever of, we've got all these point solutions and we're not happy with that, so we're going to buy it all from one vendor, maybe our insurance carrier. Well, that is a fiduciary just conflict of interest waiting to happen. There's so many ways across all these contracts that you can move money. Again, that's the whole integrated insurance company where they're just making money hand over fist by literally the conflicts of interest within those. So see if you can move away from that, and if you're a broker or an advisor, help them move away from that. And ultimately, I would say both the employer and the advisor really need to lean into the fiduciary duties to make prudent decisions, and part of that's being advised by an expert, and have a diligent process that you've documented what you're doing and how you've made that decision and why. And a lot of times, by the way, it doesn't mean you have to take the lowest bid, for example. It just means that if you don't, that you've got some good reasons for it, right? There might be strategic benefits or other kinds of reasons that you do it, and a prudent person would have come to that same conclusion. If you do that, everybody's going to be happy with the results.
Yep. Yes, you need to be able to defend your decision making, basically. That makes sense.
Yep, exactly.
That was interesting, and that was an interesting point on the point solutions as well, because you hear a lot about point solution fatigue. We work with a lot of different companies that are point solutions, but I think that what we found is that employers largely still want innovation. They just want to purchase it in a way that makes sense for them. But then to your point, there's also the fiduciary responsibility. So how do you make sure that you're managing these vendors, in a way that makes sense? And so, when you're having those contracts that, where the carrier's bringing everything, I think that's a lot harder to do. So I think that's a great point.
Yeah.
So we like
Part
to,
of what I would just say, Lindsay, just as an example, is there may be things that are fine, right, to buy from your carrier, but there are other things like stop loss insurance, right? And as an example, some of the biggest stop losses are coming from individuals with really chronic condition taking really expensive pharmacy cell gene therapy, and the stop loss carrier and the insurance carrier again can play tricks between what it's named and what time frames it happens. And so there's some things that absolutely should be separated, and some things that maybe the risk is not as high. But again, it requires some prudence to come to that determination.
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, that's great. So generally, we like to just close out with a few questions around kind of the employer benefit space. May have covered some of this, but curious, what's one lesson that you've kind of learned the hard way selling into this employer market? I know you kind of mentioned that employers need to work with those experts in the space that don't have a conflict of interest. Anything else you'd like to say there?
Yeah. So I think first off, I've hit on it and I'll hit on it again. I think a lot of the problems that employers are facing are the result of lax compliance and procurement processes. And if they brought those two things together, they'd have like really, great results, right? So start with a fiduciary compliant, procurement process, do some due diligence, create a list of short list of transparent vendors, issue an RFP, use standard contract language. Don't try to just cave into the vendor's language. Look for that lowest net price, like we talked about, not any of their rebate or AWP games. And then ultimately look for both price and the clinical outcomes, and really deliver a better benefit to your employees. And at the end of it, document the whole process. And if you do that, particularly in the pharmaceutical and the pharmacy benefit space, you're probably going to reduce your costs by 20 or 30%. I think that's a good going in estimate, and better benefits and happier employees.
Yeah.
Just not much to complain about.
Yeah, it's like everything you're looking for. That makes sense. So then when you're thinking ahead to like kind of the next year, what would you say would be some of the bigger challenges, or the biggest challenges from your perspective facing employers, in the next 12 months?
Yeah. Well, I think it's certainly going to happen over the next 12 months, but it will continue for years thereafter. I think there's two interesting trends, right? One is the workforce is getting older. They all have chronic conditions, and those chronic conditions are getting increasingly expensive to treat. And whether it's biosimilars or cancer or autoimmune therapy, cell gene therapy, it's going to get expensive. Again, we're going to have the stop loss issues, and you've got to focus in on that piece of the population. The flip side is it's always been, historically thought, hey, that's an old person thing, right? It's also happening now in the younger part of the workforce. And so they're, coming in it with their own chronic conditions, including a higher than traditional prevalence of mental health conditions. And that leads to absenteeism and presenteeism, and in some cases, some really high cost inpatient stays. And I've had a couple of clients at some of their largest, highest cost claimants were actually for mental health conditions, not for other chronic physical conditions, and that could very well continue.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think their employers are just facing a lot of challenges. Those are great points. So I would also just kind of ask as well, like we talk a lot about kind of like following the dollars in this space. So as you kind of follow the dollars from the employer benefit space, what from your perspective does that really tell you about like who this industry is really serving and maybe who it's not?
Yeah, follow the money. Who's it really serving? It's serving all the big guys, right? Large insurance companies, these large providers that are coming together into mega systems, and the drug manufacturers, right? So that's kind of the triumvirate. It is clearly not serving patients, and everybody's very familiar, right, with U.S. is spending more and has poorer outcomes than most other industrialized nations, right? Which is just a travesty. And so, I've come to the conclusion, and part of, what I'm really doing is that employers have the power to address and change a lot of that, right? And they're responsible for the health care for, half the American population. And they can change who they do business with, and they can change the terms under which they do that business. And, with a greater focus and the lawsuits and media attention on fiduciary duty, maybe now they'll have the will to act, and that's really what it takes. And so, I'd like to get that message to board directors and to executives that this is, the one area of their spend that's probably, not terribly well managed. And, if they put some focus on it, again, they could have, greater compliance and more savings and happier employees.
Yeah, I love that. That's very much tracks with kind of, our thought process at Spark as well. That like the employers have the ability to really drive a ton of change within the healthcare system. So they're just a unique audience to work with. So, well, that's wonderful. Well, thanks so much, Steve. We've appreciated having you on today. Do you want to just tell everybody kind of how to find you and perhaps your handbook and or your newsletter as well?
Yeah, happy to. So, you can always find me on, Stephen Ditto at LinkedIn. I'm also got a website at www.dittoandassociates.com, all spelled out. And you can find, my whole point of view and more information on the fiduciary handbook and the newsletter and just thoughts in general around this whole idea that better compliance leads to all of these other strategic benefits. And so we'd love to, have you subscribe. It's a free newsletter. It comes out every week and tends to focus on all of these issues and try and give people the benefit of my professional background, my personal experience, as you mentioned, and how to deliver better benefits for their plan participants.
Awesome. That's great. Well, thanks so much, Steve. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Lindsey.